Colin Dixon saw flashing blue lights appear behind him as he drove home from his shift at the Securitas Cash Depot. As he pulled over and followed the officer's orders, something felt off. A hesitation in their voice, a glance that lingered too long. He had been trained for this exact moment. If ever stopped by police, he was to tell them that he worked at the cash depot, insist on following them back to the station, never getting into their car. But tonight, he didn't follow protocol. Worse, his personal panic alarm wasn't with him. What Colin didn't realize is that these men weren't police at all. They were criminals, ex-cage fighters, career hustlers, and small-time crooks. In that moment, dressed in police uniforms, sitting in the fake patrol car, they had a choice. They could have bailed, let Colin go, given him a break on the fake speeding ticket, and disappeared back into their lives, broke, desperate, and forgotten. But they didn't. Because this was a move 8 months in the making. Burner phones, prosthetic disguises, insiders, the start of the biggest cash robbery in British history.
Forget the Great Train robbery, forget the Northern Bank in Belfast. Britain's biggest ever robbery took place in the early hours of this morning in Kent.
A multi-million-dollar heist that would spark an international manhunt. And it all started here with Colin in the backseat. There wasn't going to be a police station. Their next stop was his wife and kid. Lightning Lee Murray, a 27-year-old from South London, was a rising star in the world of mixed martial arts.
Lee Murray is one of the most legit gangsters of all time.
He had just been signed with the UFC and won his big premier match. With an 8-win, 2-loss professional record, he had the whole world ahead of him. He knew that he was about to make it big. But life is never that easy, and sometimes the fight follows you out of the ring. One night, Lightning Lee was attending the model Lauren Pope's birthday party at the Funky Buddha. This is a high-end nightclub in London's wealthiest district, Mayfair. They party until the place closed down at 3 a.m, but when Lee was leaving, a huge fight broke out involving one of his friends. His buddy was clearly outnumbered. 6 or 7 men were pounding into him, so like any good friend, Lee joined into the fight. But these lads might have been from Birmingham, because as Lee was approaching, one of them suddenly lunged, stabbing him straight in the head, then in the heart. Lee was stabbed again and again until he collapsed to the floor. Even then, the group kept kicking him while he was down, only running off when the police finally arrived. Lee was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Doctors immediately took him into emergency surgery. 7 hours of fighting to save his life. His lung had collapsed, an artery was severed. He had to be resuscitated 4 times on the operating table. It looked hopeless, and if he did survive, the outlook was grim. Doctors feared he had severe brain damage. But Lee was a fighter, and he wasn't about to stay down. Against all odds, he survived, and within 10 days, he was discharged from the hospital. Within a month, he was back in the gym. But that didn't mean he could return to the cage. He still needed to be cleared by doctors, and none would sign off on a return to fighting after the trauma he had survived. On top of that, Lee was struggling to secure a US visa. His criminal record raised too many red flags, and without access to American fights, his MMA career was effectively over. So now, Lee was 27 and unemployed in the middle of one of the world's most expensive cities. He needed money, and fast, but luckily Lee had a backup plan. A few months before the stabbing, Lee had been approached by another aspiring MMA fighter named Leah Rusha. Leah and his friend Jetmir Bukpapa had discovered something big, a hidden cash depot in Tunbridge, a small town about 30 miles south of London. The building was completely unmarked, but these two had done their homework. They'd learned it was one of the UK's main cash distribution centers, holding up to £200 million on any given day. They made their first attempt at casing the place in July 2005, but before they could even get a good look, a passing traffic officer stopped them, suspicious of their behavior. They had sat on the idea since, but now Lee was ready to do it for real. But one thing was certain, if they were going to hit the depot, they would need a crew, because this wasn't going to be easy. The place was covered in security cameras with big unclimbable steel fences, and the only entryways were guarded 24 hours a day. Crap, they were going to need a transport truck to haul all of the cash out of there. But if they could pull it off, they would never have to work again. This was the big dirty. Jetmir and Leah both worked for a man named Stuart Royal, a 48-year-old used car salesman. He was in severe debt and desperate. He needed the money, and to him, a robbery seemed like the only way to wipe the slate clean. But more importantly for the gang, he was able to offer up space at a nearby farm owned by his friend John Fowler, who wasn't going to know his farm was being lent out. This would become important later. The other thing Stuart brought along was his friend, Sean Lupton, a 47-year-old freelance construction worker and children's boxing coach. Sean had a habit of loaning Stuart money, even though it seemed that he never got it back. Sean was real excited about this, started watching Ocean's 11 over and over again in preparation for the real deal. Finally, Lee Murray had some friends that he thought might be useful. One of his oldest, Roger Coots, had access to a storage container which they thought might be useful to store millions of dollars. Lee also brought in Paul Allen, his best friend and partner in crime. He essentially became the gang's assistant, running errands here and there, buying things like whatever they needed that they didn't want to do themselves, and on these little grocery runs, Paul would often have a guy named Kane Patterson tag along. This was a guy who was facing murder charges but was later set free due to insufficient evidence. The gang had muscle, transportation, and storage cover, but there's one thing they didn't have: an inside man, and without that they couldn't do anything. But luckily, Jetmir knew just the guy for the job. Ermir Hizanosh, Jetmir's friend from Albania. Jetmir had him sign up for the recruitment agency that they found out was in charge of hiring at the cash depot. Initially, they put him on as a janitor at the local mall, so he had to get real creative, start asking to move around, and after months of jumping from job to job, Ermir finally had his interview at the cash depot and got hired on as a cash administrator. The gang was officially together, but they knew if they didn't have a solid plan, they were going to be risking a long time behind bars. The target was known as the Medway House, a large unmarked warehouse built in 1980. It was one of 28 cash centers in the UK that distributed the nation's money. Despite being intrinsic to the UK's banks, the center itself was owned and operated by Securitas Cash Management, a worldwide security organization. Yet, being one of the most substantial and trusted security organizations in the world didn't mean they were infallible. Other vaults in Liverpool and Manchester had already been the target of ram raids, where criminals drove into buildings, knocked down the walls, and simply stole whatever they could carry. Of course, that wasn't going to be the plan this time. They wanted more than what they could carry. They wanted everything, and so it had to be more intricate. The first thing they needed was details about the inner workings of the facility. This is where their inside man, Ermir, came in. He worked with Jetmir to draw up diagrams at the depot, map the entry points, learned which areas had CCTV coverage, and the different site protocols, who had access to what. They were using all of this to formulate their plan of attack, but they didn't want just his word. They want to actually see inside. So Paul Allen and Kane were sent out to purchase special spy supplies that could fit inside Ermir's clothing. He used this to secretly record videos. This way, when the gang actually showed up on site, there would be no surprises. They would have seen all of this before. And based on all of this information, they decided that the best way to actually get into the facility would be through a Tiger Kidnapping, a tactic where someone is kidnapped to force another person, usually someone with access or authority, to help carry out a crime. It's not just about taking a hostage, it's about taking a hostage to control someone else with critical access. That man would be Colin Dixon, the depot manager. He started working at the Medway House in 1987, meaning he had been there for almost 20 years, one of the longest standing and most loyal employees. And to make sure that Colin did what he was asked, the gang was planning to take hostage his wife and young son. In order to kidnap Colin, the gang decided that they would dress up as policemen, then fake an arrest when he was on his way back home from work. But there was one problem. If they were to dress as policemen, they would have to show their faces, which meant they would be easily identifiable in a lineup, so they would need disguises. Luckily, Lee Murray knew just the person. He had a friend named Michael Demetris, ran a hair salon in Forest Hill called Hair Hectic. Now, a haircut wasn't going to do the trick either, but he had just hired a new trainee hairdresser, a woman named Michelle Hogg. And Michelle actually had a diploma in theater studies that included courses in prosthetics. Lee wanted to use her expertise to make disguises for all the men who would have to show their face during the big heist, but couldn't tell Michelle what these prosthetics were actually being used for. So instead, Lee spun a story that he was working on a video game about cage fighting. It was going to be called Hitman, and him and all his mates were going to be actors in the game, and so they needed disguises. She agreed, was excited to work on the project, but disguises weren't the only thing they were going to need. To pull off a job of this scale, they also needed serious transport, multiple cars, vans, even a transport truck to move all the people, weapons, and eventually millions in stolen cash. Heck, one vehicle had to be kitted out to look like a police cruiser. That job fell to Stuart Royal, who was in charge of sourcing untraceable vehicles. After months of preparation, the crew had everything in place. Vehicles were stashed at Stuart's friend's farm, they had weapons, maps, inside intel. They even knew Colin Dixon's routines down to the minute. On paper, it looked airtight. Truth be told though, not everyone on the crew was exactly a criminal genius. Still, they were confident, maybe too confident. They weren't just chasing a payday, they were chasing the biggest cash heist in British history. And now, it was time to make their move. Speaking of making some moves, as you know, what I do on this channel is deep dive into complex stories that require hours of research to ensure I'm bringing you high quality and accurate information. But there are so many viewpoints that try to take your attention away with misleading headlines and complicated agendas. If you're like me, you open your phone and, what, the markets are tanking, a recession is incoming, 2 swipes later, stocks are apparently now hitting a record high. Same day, same story, totally different spins. Makes me remember that feeds aren't built for truth. They're built to keep you scrolling, and the louder the headline, the better it sells. When the noise gets this loud, it's not just annoying, it decides what you buy, how you vote, who you trust, without you even noticing. I got tired of guessing which version was real, so I switched to Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. Check it out, it's an app and a website that pulls stories from over 50,000 sources, then drops them into one clean feed and tags them with their bias, how reliable they are, and even who owns them. One glance, I see how the left and the right and everyone in between frame the same event. So I get the whole picture in seconds. I've completely escaped those algorithms. And with Ground News, how a story is covered becomes just as important as the story itself. And I like that there's filters, tags, and a high-level summary that will give me the gist of a story before I go and dig deeper into it. They even have customized interest pages for topics like hacking and tech, which is perfect if you're into the same sort of stuff that I cover here. Plus, it's just so convenient to have this all aggregated in one spot. So I've partnered with Ground News to get you unlimited access at 40% off their Vantage plan. That's the one I use, and it's only $5 a month. So right now, go to ground.news/crumb or click the link in the description, pinned comment, or heck, just scan the QR code on screen to take back control of the information you're consuming. But be quick because this is available for only a limited time. Colin wakes up bright and early, 6:30 a.m. and starts getting ready for work. Normally, he would attach a personal attack alarm to his belt, but he had sat on it a few days prior, breaking it, and so he leaves for work completely unprotected. It's like any other day. Clocks in at 9, runs the cash depot, doesn't steal any money. By 5:30, he's getting out of there, excited to get back home to have dinner with his beautiful wife and son. But he's got a long commute ahead of him, almost an hour. And at 6:20, just 10 minutes away from home, he gets lit up by flashing blue lights, but the actual car has no police decals on it. Thinking it was just an unmarked vehicle, he pulled over. As the officers approached Colin, they asked him to get out, told him that he had been stopped for multiple reports of him speeding. This is where he made one of the biggest mistakes of his life. Because Colin worked a job with a high risk of crime, he went through special training on how to respond to police. He was supposed to give the officer a slip of paper identifying himself as a cash center worker. Then he would offer to follow the police to their station. Once there, they could ask as many questions as they needed. The goal of this protocol was to minimize the risk of kidnapping by someone posing as an officer. But we don't know his real reasons, but Colin didn't do that. Instead, he followed the police officers to the vehicle and got into their car without a second thought. The officers put handcuffs on him and they were a little too tight to sit comfortable. After some erratic driving, Colin started to realize that these were not your normal police officers. In fact, they weren't police officers at all. At 7, after almost 40 minutes of driving, they arrive at a farm, not a police station. Colin was told to get out of the car and into a white van. By this point, Colin's wife Lynn was really starting to get worried. It wasn't usual for him not to be home on time, and he wasn't returning any of her calls. By 7:30, he still hadn't made it back. He had long missed dinner, and so she put on a TV show, tried to calm herself down, hoping that he would come through the door any second with a normal explanation. An hour goes by, and then there's a knock at her door. It was the police. There was a panic button in her entryway, but Lynn wasn't alarmed. She let them inside. The officers told Lynn that Colin had gotten into an accident and was in the hospital. They offered to drive her there and insisted that she goes and wakes up her son to come with. Heading out the door, the worry about her husband tapered the feeling of something being off. These officers were awful athletic looking, even for officers. And why would they be driving an unmarked car? As she went to let her son in the back door, she could hear Magic FM was playing on the radio, and this was the last sign she needed. She asked, "Can I see your identification?" But it was too late. The second she said that, they shoved her and her son into the car screaming. 20 minutes down the road later, they were transferred into a red van. Another hour went by, and finally they were stopped. They were at the farm with Colin, except they couldn't see each other. The gang kept them separated. While Lynn and her son huddled for warmth in the back of the van, Colin was being pressed for every detail he knew about the Medway house. They told him his family had arrived, but Colin refused to say another word until he saw that they were okay with his own eyes. And when he did, that was it. The fear settled in. These men were serious. He knew then he'd do whatever it took to keep them safe. With that, the questions resumed. Every procedure, every schedule, every weakness. They squeezed out as much as they could. Then they decided it was time, and Colin was going to be the man to get them inside. The crew stripped off the movie set prosthetics and suited up for the real job. Chose more or less random outfits, things that would hide their face but still pass a quick glance. No two outfits were exactly alike. In the back of one of the vans lay a persuasion kit, a 9mm pistol, a pump-action shotgun, a compact Scorpion machine pistol, and an AK-47. Enough firepower to make cooperation the only smart option. Only Kane kept on his full police uniform. That costume was their key to the front gate. Gear sorted, the 7 men, Lee, Kane, Leah, Roger, Jetmir, Stewart, and inside man, Emir, split into separate vehicles and rolled toward Tonbridge with their hostages in tow. 1:21 a.m., now February 22nd, the convoy reaches the Medway House. In the lead car, Kane, still in his police uniform, has been driving with Colin pinned in the trunk. 100 yards from the gate, he brakes, steps out, and orders Colin to slide behind the wheel. Optics are everything. The night guard must see the depot manager driving and hear his voice over the intercom. A familiar face, a quick word, and the barrier should lift without a fuss. As they pulled up, to Colin's dismay, this was the one day a month that the man inside the control room gets swapped with a random worker. This was meant to be a security caution, but tonight would cause more harm than good because that random person was Gary Barclay, a newer worker at the depot that still hadn't gotten a grip on all of the safety procedures. Gary immediately recognized Colin, let him in, even though there was no reason for him to ever be at work so late. Gary just saw him with an officer and assumed that the two of them were there on official business. They park, walk in, head straight for that control room. Before rookie Gary can even ask why, the officer wrenches his arms behind him and zip ties him to a chair. While doing this, Colin moves one of the CCTV cameras away from the officer. While on the outside, this seems like he's going out of his way to help the robbers. The truth was, any movement of the cameras was supposed to alert the local police station, but unfortunately, that night, they must not have been paying attention. Colin then did what he was ordered. He pushed a big green button on the console, opening the vehicle gate and letting the rest of the gang inside. Headlights flood the yard as a big white lorry and a Vauxhall Vectra roll onto campus. Later, detectives reviewing the CCTV footage would see 4 men coming out of the vehicles, giving each of them a nickname. The first was Stopwatch, wore a paintball-style mask, had an AK-47, and an actual stopwatch bouncing on his chest. Little did they know this was Lightning Lee Murray. Up next was Hoodie, had his hood up, a gas mask on, shotgun, and white socks visible over his pant legs. Most likely Paul Allen. Then there was Shorty, who was, well, short. Brandishing the Scorpion machine pistol, he had on a blue ballistic vest. This was Leah. Last but not least was Mr. Average. There was nothing special about him really. He might have had a ballistic vest on under his boiler suit, but other than that, he was just average, and this was Roger Coots. Colin, handshaking, slaps the access button, letting the 4 nicknames from the lobby into the secured area of the building. They immediately start rounding up the night staff. Black plastic cable ties instead of handcuffs, so tight that the staff's fingertips are turning white. This was taken straight out of Ocean's 11. While all of this is happening, Lynn and her son are still sitting in the back of the big white truck. They were being guarded by Jetmir, later nicknamed by police as High Vis because, well, he had a high visibility jacket over top of his suit. Just shy of 2 a.m., they finally get the vault open. It was filled to capacity, more than 200 million pounds, all physically sorted into giant wire cages based on their denomination. These cages were huge, each weighed more than a quarter ton, way too big to move with just muscle, so they had to use a forklift. There was only one problem. None of the robbers were forklift certified. In fact, none of them even knew how to drive one, so they had to untie someone. They decided to bring over Tony Mason, the only staff member there trained to use the forklift, but he decided to do some malicious compliance. He knew exactly how to maneuver it to drive in and out with the cash cages, but instead he kept driving the forklift into the wall in an attempt to get the fork stuck, acting like it wasn't really possible to get the cages out of the vault. Frustrated, they called over Colin, insisted that he try, but he's just a manager at the depot. He's not the one driving the big forklifts around normally. In desperation with the clock ticking, some of the members just start scooping up armfuls of money and running it to the truck. All the while, Tony's still being pressured to get the forklift to work, and losing hope about getting it stuck, worrying that they're going to catch on to his ruse, he finally drove it right, but he started by grabbing cash cages with lesser value, hoping to dampen the financial disaster as much as possible. One by one, the gang members tirelessly loaded the cash cages onto the truck. All the while, Lynn and her child are still tied up back there, eventually realizing that, hey, we should probably move her out of the way. Shorty brought them outside and made them face the wall of the loading bay. In 66 minutes, they had taken 17 cages, 3 trolleys, and armfuls of loose bundles, totaling just under 53 million pounds. With the other 153 million sitting there mocking them, they had to go, had already spent too long in the depot. Now, their attention shifted to the hostages. Right now, they were all there, tied up together in the warehouse. All were cooperating, just as they hoped. But they knew, if they wanted to escape scot-free, they needed to make sure the hostages wouldn't get up to any funny business after they left. They needed to buy themselves as much time as possible, or else all of this would have been for nothing. Then, the gang noticed the empty money cages. They locked from the outside, and you needed a special key to enter. They would be perfect. The robbers began forcing the hostages into the empty money cages. These cages were built for cash, not people, so comfort wasn't exactly a priority. Each cage stood just about 5 feet tall, making it impossible for the hostages to stand upright. The men and women were separated and squeezed into cages in pairs. Everyone, including Lynn and her child, were locked up, leaving Colin for last. Fear surged among the depot workers. With the heist nearing its end, a terrifying question lingered. Now that the robbers had their cash, would they eliminate any witnesses? In the movies, thieves rarely left anyone behind to tell the tale. But luckily, that wouldn't be the case. After they knew the hostages were not going to move, they made a beeline for their vehicles. Later, detectives would name another man driver. This was most likely Stuart Royal. He was joined by High Viz in driving the big lorry truck out of the depot. They left first. Then, now pressing on 3 a.m., the remaining gang members took off in the different vehicles, officially millionaires. But the departure of the robbers didn't mean safety for the hostages. They were still trapped in the warehouse with no obvious way to call for help. Luckily, one of them, Mel Sampson, realized she had a key to the cage in her back pocket. The only issue was her hands were zip-tied. However, the cage holding Lynn and her child had a small gap, just large enough for the child to squeeze through. Bravely, he retrieved the key from Mel's pocket. By 3 a.m., everyone was free and out of their cages, but they didn't want to immediately set off all of the alarms. They wanted to make sure that the robbers were not coming back. Once they felt confident, they finally activated the alarm. Colin dialed 999, told them about what had happened, but got the feeling that the dispatchers didn't understand the gravity of the situation. When they asked him how much was stolen, he said tens of millions. Within a few minutes, 2 officers arrived at the depot. Since they were originally scammed by fakes, the hostages made sure that this time they were for real. Once it was sure to be safe, they were let in. And for the depot employees, their nightmare was finally coming to an end. But for the gang, their getaway was just starting. While police scrambled to piece together what had happened, the gang was already on the move with nearly 53 million pounds in cash. But before they could vanish, they had to get rid of the evidence. Their first stop was the farm. There, under the cover of night, they lit a bonfire and began torching anything that could connect them to the crime. Burner phones, receipts, even the personal belongings of Lynn and her son that was left behind in the getaway vehicle. Then came the money. Most of it was still sitting in the wire cages straight from the depot. They each loaded up on the loose bills, taking tens of thousands of dollars. But they couldn't take it all, it was too heavy, so they started stashing them in barns, garages, storage units, until they could return back to properly launder the haul. By sunrise, it became very clear that this robbery was big. When the police first got there, they thought maybe 1 or 2 million pounds were unaccounted for, but as the dust settled, they learned that it was 53 million. It was a number so big that it threatened to bankrupt Securitas. And if Securitas fell, the ripple effect would shut down cash centers across the country. A potential economic catastrophe. That morning, the heist dominated the headlines. It was an international embarrassment. The pressure to crack the case was so immediate that within hours, Securitas and their insurers put up a £2 million reward. They thought whoever was able to pull this off had to be highly trained specialist, but the truth, as we know, was far less sophisticated. Little did they know that this was done by a bunch of ex-cage fighters, career crooks, and locals with long rap sheets. They had more or less gotten incredibly lucky. Colin's broken arm, the last-minute employee switch at the depot, security protocols that failed in all the wrong ways. Their actual plan had holes. It was sheer luck that got them through. The trouble was now, if they left any evidence, made one wrong move, well, time would be against them. It would be discovered during the investigation, and in crime, you're playing for keeps. The entire gang could go down. Of all places, police found one of the gang's vans abandoned outside the Hook and Hatchet pub. Inside, they uncovered a pile of incriminating evidence. There was a paper towel with a footprint from Colin and Lynn's son, a gray glove that was worn during the heist, and most damning of all, a sales invoice showing exactly where the van had been purchased. It traced back to none other than Stuart Royal, used car salesman turned accomplice, but for now, it only made him a person of interest. They wanted to speak with him. This van was the first break in the case. The next came from a woman who never even stepped foot in the depot. Michelle Hogg, the makeup artist behind the prosthetics, was at home sleeping, her first real day off in weeks. The crew's demands had run her into the ground, but her rest didn't last long. That morning, her mother called, wanted to chat about the massive robbery in Tunbridge. She couldn't believe it. But when she heard the news, Michelle's stomach dropped. The location, the timing, the disguises, it all clicked. She hadn't been designing prosthetics for a video game. She'd been helping stage the biggest cash heist in UK history. That night, her boss Michael showed up at her door with an envelope of cash and a warning. Don't talk to the police. Say you know nothing. Michelle later said she refused the money, but the message was clear and terrifying. She was horrified. She had no idea how dangerous the men she worked with really were. Now she feared for her life. If she came forward, if she was the one who brought them down, what might they do to her? As soon as Michael left, Michelle snapped into panic mode. She raced through her home, gathering anything from the job, used silicone, bald caps, grease paint, latex scraps, and dumped it into trash bags. She dragged those bags to the curb and hoped that the garbage truck would take them away in the morning, that she could forget about everything. But someone had already talked. Employees at Hair Hectic, Michael's salon, tipped off the police. They said that Michael and Michelle had been working on some kind of inside job. That made Michael the first real suspect. Even though he wasn't directly involved in the robbery itself, he simply knew Lee Murray had made the introduction to Michelle. But now he was caught up in their mess and, for some reason, doing some of their dirty work. Worse, he knew names and faces and didn't have any of the millions to keep his mouth shut. At 1 p.m., February 23rd, just a day and a half after the robbery, the police arrested him. By 2:30 p.m., they were at Michelle's door. When she didn't answer, they forced their way in. They found her on the upstairs landing, shaken but unharmed, and the timing couldn't have been any better. They had beaten the garbage truck. In the trash bin outside, they recovered everything she tried to throw away. The evidence was damning. Michelle was immediately arrested, charged with conspiracy to commit armed robbery. Now, Michelle obviously wasn't going to take all the blame, but getting to the bottom of her story was going to take some time. Meanwhile, the police had just caught their next big break. 2 days later, police were questioning a man named Chris Bowles, an Olympian. He'd competed in judo at the 1980 Moscow Games, but this interview had nothing to do with sports. They had received an anonymous tip telling them to search his van, so they did, and what they found was damning. In the back was a black zip-up bag. Inside, a balaclava, bulletproof vest, one of the firearms used in the heist, and 1.3 million pounds in stolen cash. This wasn't a good look for Chris. When they asked him about it, Chris said, "Hey, these bags aren't mine. They actually belong to Leah and Jetmir, two of my friends." He said that Leah said he was having some trouble with his partner and just needed to stash some things somewhere safe just for a little while, and Chris, trying to do a favor, agreed to help out. Surprisingly, this story checked out. Investigators believe that he had no real involvement in the robbery, so despite the mountain of evidence in his van, Chris Bowles was released. But this was a disaster for Leah and Jetmir because now the police had two new prime suspects. The race was on. Detectives needed to find them fast. Time is always against them in these cases. But this wasn't going to be like Michael and Michelle's arrest. These guys were considered armed, dangerous, and unpredictable, so the police weren't taking any chances. At 3 p.m., they moved on Jetmir's house, fully prepared for a standoff. But instead of a gunfight, all they found was his wife in the kitchen cooking chili. She swore Jetmir wasn't home, but the officers didn't believe her. They pulled her from the house just in case. She thought it must have been been an immigration raid, completely unaware her husband had helped pull off the biggest cash robbery in British history. At the same time, another tactical unit was smashing through the patio doors of Leah's place. The raid went just as poorly. No suspects, no shootout. The house was empty. But what both homes did have was evidence, and a lot of it. They found one of the boiler suits worn during the robbery, a backpack with cable ties, rolls of tape, 10 shotgun cartridges, the kind used in the heist. It was more than enough to confirm what police now suspected. Leah and Jetmir weren't just names in someone else's story. They were there the night of the robbery, but still, the money was missing and these two men were nowhere to be found. The next day, a blue BMW was tearing through the streets with two police cruisers in hot pursuit. The chase winded down roads and through towns until the officers finally managed to box the car in. When they finally opened the door, it was Stuart Royal, the used car salesman turned getaway driver caught red-handed, arrested on suspicion of armed robbery. Word of Stuart's arrest spread fast, and it sent a clear message to the rest of the gang. The walls were closing in. That's when Lightning Lee Murray and his best friend, Paul Allen, made their move. They knew sticking around meant prison, but getting out wouldn't be easy. Airports were crawling with security, customs would be on high alert for anyone trying to smuggle millions in stolen government cash, so instead of flying out, they slipped onto a late-night ferry bound for France. From there, they drove north into the Netherlands, passing quietly through Amsterdam, and eventually made their way south to Morocco. Meanwhile, Jetmir and Leah made a much less brilliant call. After their homes were raided, they checked into a chain hotel just outside of London, barely an hour away from the scene of the crime. The day after Stuart Royal's arrest, they decided that it would be a great idea to go visit Jetmir's sister. Probably thought they were being careful. Surely the police wouldn't be watching his sister. But as they neared her apartment at exactly 1:40 p.m., the police ambushed them, blowing out their car tires. Leah and Jetmir bailed, trying to run away on foot, but it was over. The officers swarmed. They were too prepared, tackled them to the ground, and took them into custody. The arrests were piling up, but the money, nowhere's to be found. They had so many people in custody now. Surely someone was gonna talk. A few days later, on March 2nd, they got a tip. It led them to a storage unit at the Graves Industrial Estate, belonged to none other than Roger Coutts. When they cut off the lock, opened up the doors, nearly £10 million in cash, stacked and stashed, just sitting there. But where was Roger? When the police did a little check, it turned out that he was on a skiing holiday in Switzerland with his pregnant girlfriend. No burner phone, no aliases, just carving up the slopes like nothing ever happened. And honestly, he might have gotten away with it had he just stayed in Switzerland, but he didn't. On Saturday, March 4th, his return flight was due to land back in the UK. The police were ready. He hailed a taxi, thinking he was in the clear, but he wasn't. On his way home, that taxi was pulled over. Police opened the door and arrested him on the spot. Meanwhile, back at the farm, investigators weren't done digging. The site had been combed over by forensic teams, and eventually they even called in the British Army to help sift through the remains of the bonfire with painstaking detail. Among the ashes, they found scorched burner phones and something even more personal, Lynn and her child's belongings. It was a reminder that there was real victims in this case. People that feared for their lives, and all of this was going to be used against the gang, who most of which had already been arrested in court. The only problem left was catching the few members who, so far, had managed to slip through the cracks and, well, finding the other £40 million. One of those still at large was the inside man, Ermir Hizanosh. After the heist, operations at the depot were immediately shut down, so Ermir was reassigned by his hiring agency to a quiet post office job, but not for long. March 2nd, police start digging into employee files at the Medway house. That's when they noticed something interesting. Ermir had ties to Jetmir Bukpapa, who, as we know, was already locked up. So they brought Ermir in for questioning, but he was a cool cucumber man, gave calm, consistent answers, no panic, no cracks. He was so convincing that they let him walk. For a moment, looked like he might actually get away with it. But the police weren't done. A month later, April 4th, they brought him in again. More questions, more denials, and again, they let him go. At this point, Ermir had to be feeling a little invincible. But come April 11th, they had a third round of questioning, this time more direct. The focus was on Jetmir, and the evidence was stacking up. Police had found phone records showing over 70 calls between Ermir and Jetmir around the time of the robbery. When confronted, Ermir denied it, claimed that the calls never never happened. That was strike one. Then they asked about the strange payments into his bank account. Over £30,000 deposited in the weeks surrounding the heist. He didn't have a good explanation. Strike two. But the biggest blow came when police found something even more damning. Security footage showed that he had been filming secretly inside the depot on January 16th, weeks before the heist. They asked him to bring in the clothes he wore that day, hoping to match them to the footage. But Ermir said he couldn't. Apparently, he had recycled them because, according to him, he only wears brand new clothes. At that point, police weren't buying a word of it. That was strike three, and just like that, Ermir was charged with conspiracy to rob the Securitas cash depot. But still, the ringleader, Lee Murray, was still missing, along with Paul Allen, Sean Lupton, Kane Patterson, and most of the money. 1,800 miles from London, Lee Murray and Paul Allen were living it up in Morocco, pretending to be nothing more than two lads on an extended holiday. In reality, they were hauling a slice of the biggest cash grab in British history, and it was already burning a hole in their pockets. Lee bought this £700,000 mansion in an upscale area, complete with oyster shell armchairs and a mural of his big 2004 cage fight, and soon the neighborhood learned a new sound. The high-pitched whine of a Ferrari that he bought for cash, plus a BMW X5 that he would use for errands. Inside the villa, wardrobes became makeshift bank vaults, and every night these two were hidden clubs. Booger sugar and champagne, waiters were being tipped an entire month's wage, and they were flying in girls from London that they knew, promising them great Moroccan sun and free cosmetic surgery upon arrival. They also bought a lot of guns, illegal guns, for cash. Lee called this his early retirement. Paul just grinned and ordered another round. All of this is to say they were doing the opposite of lying low. They must have felt insulated in Morocco from British prosecution. But little did they know, almost from the moment they landed, UK investigators had tipped off Moroccan police, and without realizing it, they had been under 24-hour surveillance. Then, on June 25th, 2006, 4 months after the robbery, Moroccan police finally made their move. 50 officers, 30 of them undercover, sealed off the Rabat Mega Mall while Lee and Paul were on another shopping spree. The cops knew exactly who they were dealing with, two violent men, potentially with guns, so they didn't take any chances. The moment Lee stepped out of Tommy Hilfiger, the cops swarmed. He sprinted, ex-cage fighter instincts, but a rugby tackle ended the chase. Paul froze, hands up, outside of a Starbucks. Back at the villa, raids turned up 3 handguns, a MAC-10, 2 kilos of cocaine, and another mountain of stolen cash. The party was officially over. But Morocco doesn't extradite its citizens, and Lee Murray's father was a Moroccan. So when the UK requested his extradition, Morocco said, well, we're gonna need to do a lot of really lengthy trials. For the time being, they hit him with some local charges, drug and gun possession, and for allegedly assaulting police officers during his arrest. He was locked up in Sale Prison, a notoriously brutal facility just outside of the capital. Paul Allen wasn't so lucky. With no Moroccan heritage to hide behind, he was greenlit for extradition, but the paperwork was slow, and in the meantime, he too was dumped in the Sale prison. 8 months later, on February 22nd, 2007, Lee faced his first Moroccan trial on those minor charges. The result? 4 to 8 months. Time already served. He should have been free, but before he could walk out of the front gates, UK authorities filed a second extradition request. So they kept him locked up, this time under a new case file directly tied to the Securitas robbery. From that point forward, the question wasn't if Lee would be punished, but how. Meanwhile, back in the UK, armored vans, rooftop snipers, even the jury was smuggled in through staff entrances. £1 million spent in security for a single trial. Inside the bulletproof dock, Stuart Royal, Leah Rusha, Jetmir Bukpapa, Roger Coots, and the inside man, Ermir Hizanash. Michelle Hogg sat across the aisle, crown witness in exchange for freedom. Prosecutor Sir John Nutting laid it out like a Hollywood script, then rolled the CCTV, balaclavas, cable ties, and a small arsenal of guns. Colin Dixon testified by video link from a safe house. His hands still shook, describing the cages. When the verdicts landed a year later, the room fell silent. For Stuart, Leah, Jetmir, and Roger, they were sentenced to life with a minimum of 15 years. Now, in the UK, life doesn't mean that you die in prison. It means that you're eligible for parole after a minimum term, in this case, 15 years. But even then, they're never truly free. If they make parole, they will remain on a license for the rest of their lives, meaning they can be recalled to prison at any time if they break the law or violate parole. It's like walking around on a leash forever. Ermir got off a little easier. He was sentenced to 20 years with parole eligibility after 10. Meanwhile, Paul was still sitting in the Sale prison when this UK verdict broke, but not for long. After 23 months of waiting, he was extradited back to London in May 2008 to face trial. Back in Britain, the Old Bailey treated him like Hannibal Lecter. He was helicoptered in daily from Belmarsh because ground transport was deemed too risky. The tabloids had a field day. Apparently each of these rides cost £30,000, and the first jury couldn't reach a verdict. On the eve of his retrial in September 2009, Paul pled guilty to conspiracy, but he swore he never carried a weapon. He was sentenced to 18 years. Back in Morocco, Lee Murray was sitting in legal limbo. Moroccan courts dragged out the decision, debating whether to send him to the UK or prosecute him at home, as they fielded a barrage of requests from the UK. At one point, they even entertained a prisoner swap, but ultimately that didn't go through. By mid-2009, he had already spent over 2 years behind bars with no clear end in sight. Then, finally, a ruling. On June 24, 2009, the Court of Appeal in Casablanca confirmed what many expected. Lee Murray was a Moroccan citizen. This meant no extradition ever. This meant that the £53 million Securitas robbery case against him would escalate now, and quickly. Just days later, prison officials caught wind of an escape plot. Hacksaw blades hidden in biscuit tins. Lee was also caught with a laptop, designer clothes, and 5 kilos of cannabis, all smuggled in through bribed guards. He was thrown into a punishment cell. Fellow inmates had turned on him, furious over the special treatment he had bought. Come June 1st, 2010, Lee finally got his day in court. He was officially convicted of masterminding the Securitas heist. The sentence, 10 years, but prosecutors weren't satisfied. They appealed, calling the verdict far too lenient. On November 30th, 2010, the Court of Appeal handed down its final decision, 25 years. Worse still, by 2011, he was transferred to a stripped-down high-security unit after being accused of fathering a child during conjugal visits. Then, in 2016, when Morocco opened its newest Supermax facility, Taifelt 2nd, Lee was one of the first high-risk inmates moved there. This is hard time for the country's most dangerous criminals. It has been described as having an atmosphere where survival itself becomes an achievement. Lee Murray is still behind bars today. His projected release date remains 2035. He's filed a petition for royal pardon, but so far, nothing has come of that. Today, most of the players in the heist are still serving hard time, but a few vanished without a trace. Kane Patterson is believed to be hiding out somewheres in the West Indies, maybe sitting on a beach sipping a pina colada watching the tide roll in. Sean Lupton abandoned his wife and kids, apparently fleeing somewheres in northern Cyprus. He might have been the gang's most dedicated student after all. Remember, this was the guy that was watching Ocean's 11 on repeat in the lead up to the robbery. Looks like he learned from the best. And those are just the ones we know about. No one can say for sure how many people were involved, especially when it came to laundering the money, and how many slipped under the radar entirely. Britain, for its part, narrowly avoided an economic disaster. Securitas didn't collapse. The insurance claim went through. There was no national emergency. The system held, but that doesn't mean there wasn't lasting consequences. Colin Dixon and his wife Lynn and their young son had to abandon their home, living in police safe houses under the constant fear of retaliation. Eventually, they fled the country altogether, resettling in Australia just to feel safe. I mean, even the robbers weren't safe. In 2019, just 4 months after being released on parole, Paul Allen, living in northeast London with his wife and kids, was attacked by 2 gunmen. They fired 6 rounds through his patio doors. A single Glock bullet struck his spine, paralyzing him for life. 3 men were convicted in 2025 for the hit, but their motive is still under investigation. What we do know is that over £32 million from the heist is still missing, gone, unrecovered, possibly sitting in storage units or quietly funding lives far away from Tunbridge. But those are stories for another day.